Eleanor Davies drove her sleek silver Mercedes slowly down the palm-lined streets of Beverly Hills. The afternoon sun made everything look golden and perfect. But Eleanor did not feel perfect. Even after 3 years, the emptiness in her heart remained where Richard, her husband, used to be. At 52, Eleanor was still beautiful. Her dark hair had a few silver strands that she never bothered to color. Battle scars, Richard used to call them with a smile. Her blue eyes, once bright with happiness, now carried a permanent sadness. Today was Thursday. Every Thursday, Eleanor drove through the neighborhoods where she and Richard had once dreamed of buying a home before they had decided on their Malibu estate instead. It was her ritual, painful but necessary. As Eleanor turned onto Maple Drive, her eyes caught something that made her slam on the brakes. A tall man in a gray suit was walking up the driveway of a massive white mansion. Eleanor's hands began to shake on the steering wheel. "No," she whispered. "It's not possible." The man had Richard's exact build, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. He had Richard's walk, that confident stride with a slight bounce in each step. When he turned slightly to say something to the security guard, Eleanor saw his profile. Her heart stopped. It was Richard's face, the same strong jaw, the same slightly crooked nose from a college football injury. Even the way he gestured with his left hand as he spoke, it was all Richard. But Richard was dead. Eleanor had identified his body after the yacht explosion 3 years ago. She had watched his casket lowered into the ground. A car humped behind her. Eleanor realized she had stopped in the middle of the road. With shaking hands, she pulled over to the curb across from the mansion. She couldn't breathe properly. Was her mind playing tricks on her? The man disappeared inside the massive iron gates that closed behind him. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the place where he had stood just moments before. "I need to see him again," she whispered to herself. Eleanor waited in her car for 3 hours, watching the mansion. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street. Her phone rang several times, her assistant, her lawyer, her sister, but she ignored them all. As darkness fell, lights came on inside the mansion. Eleanor could see movement behind the large windows, but she couldn't make out any faces. Was the Richard look-alike still in there? Who was he? Why did he look so exactly like her husband? Finally, when it was completely dark, Eleanor started her car. She needed to think. She needed a plan. If there was even the smallest chance that man was somehow Richard. As she drove home to her empty Malibu estate, Eleanor's mind raced. The man couldn't be Richard. Richard was dead. She had seen his body. But what if? What if somehow? When she arrived home, Eleanor went straight to her study. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album. There, smiling up at her, was Richard on their last anniversary together. She touched his face in the photo with trembling fingers. "Who did I see today?" she whispered to the empty room. Eleanor picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't used in years. "Jensen Investigations," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Jensen," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need your help with something unusual." Whatever it took, Eleanor was going to find out who that man was. She had to know. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man who looked exactly like Richard. By morning, dark circles had formed under her eyes, but her mind was clear. She needed answers. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Frank Jensen arrived at her Malibu estate. He was a short man with a weathered face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Eleanor had hired him years ago when she suspected one of Richard's business partners was stealing from the company. Jensen had proven her right within a week. "Mrs. Davies," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "It's been a while." Eleanor led him to her sunroom overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Her housekeeper had set out coffee and pastries, but Eleanor couldn't eat. She handed Jensen a folder. "These are recent photos of Richard before he died," she said. "And this is the address of the mansion where I saw the man yesterday." Jensen studied the photos carefully. "You're sure the resemblance was this strong?" "It wasn't just a resemblance," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "If I didn't know better, I would swear it was Richard himself." Jensen nodded, not questioning her further. That's what Eleanor liked about him. He took her seriously. "I'll need a retainer," he said. "This kind of work can get expensive." Eleanor wrote him a check without even asking the amount. Money was no object. Not when it came to this. Find out everything you can about who lives in that house, she said. Everything. After Jensen left, Eleanor tried to keep busy. She called her assistant about upcoming charity functions. She spoke with her financial advisor about investments, but her mind kept returning to the man she had seen. 3 days later, Jensen called. I have some preliminary information, he said. The house belongs to a man named Alexander Wells. He bought it 2 years ago for $28 million. Cash. Eleanor's heart raced. What does he look like? That's the thing, Mrs. Davies. This guy is practically a ghost. No social media, almost no photos anywhere. He's some kind of shipping magnate. Started his company about 3 years ago, and now it's worth billions. 3 years ago, right after Richard died. But I did manage to get some security footage from a business event he attended last month. Jensen continued. I'm sending it to your email now. Eleanor hung up and rushed to her computer. Her hands trembled as she opened the email and clicked on the video file. The footage was grainy, shot from a security camera high in a corner of what looked like a hotel ballroom. Eleanor watched as people in formal wear mingled, and then she saw him, Alexander Wells, entering the room. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. Even in the poor quality video, the resemblance to Richard was undeniable. The height, the walk, the way he adjusted his tie before shaking hands with someone, all pure Richard. This is impossible, Eleanor whispered to the empty room. She called Jensen back immediately. I need more, she said without preamble. I need to know everything about this Alexander Wells, where he came from, his background. And most importantly, I need to see him in person. That might be difficult, Jensen replied. He's very private. Rarely goes out in public. Find a way, Eleanor said firmly. Whatever it costs. After hanging up, Eleanor went to her bedroom and opened the safe hidden behind a painting. Inside was a small velvet box. She took it out with shaking hands and opened it. Inside was Richard's watch, an antique Patek Philippe that had belonged to his grandfather. The watch that hadn't been on his body when it was recovered after the yacht explosion. Eleanor stared at the watch for a long time. Then she made another call. Martha, she said to her longtime friend who served on multiple charity boards. I need a favor. Does your Arts Foundation still need major donors for the summer gala? An idea was forming in Eleanor's mind. If Alexander Wells wouldn't come to her, she would find a way to get to him. The Los Angeles Museum of Modern Art sparkled with lights. Rich people in expensive clothes filled the grand hall, drinking champagne and talking about art they rarely understood. Eleanor stood near the entrance, her heart beating fast in her chest. Are you sure he's coming? She asked Jensen, who stood beside her dressed as her security guard. My source confirmed it. Wells donated $1 million to this event. He'll be here, Jensen replied quietly. Eleanor smoothed down her black dress. She had chosen it carefully, elegant but not too flashy. Her hair was styled differently than usual, and she wore more makeup than she normally did. She didn't want Wells to recognize her if he was somehow connected to Richard. Remember, just get close enough to see him clearly, Jensen warned. Don't approach him directly. Eleanor nodded, but she had already decided to ignore this advice. After 2 weeks of waiting, she needed answers more than she needed safety. At precisely 8:30, a stir went through the crowd. Eleanor turned to see Alexander Wells entering the museum. In person, the resemblance to Richard was even more shocking. He had the same tall, lean build. The same way of standing with weight shifted to one leg. Even his beard was trimmed exactly how Richard had always worn his. My God, whispered Jensen, you weren't exaggerating. Eleanor couldn't speak. She watched as Wells moved through the crowd, stopping occasionally to shake hands with people. He smiled Richard's smile, the one that showed just a hint of his teeth on the left side. I'm going to talk to him, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mrs. Davies, I don't think. But Eleanor was already moving through the crowd toward Wells. She carefully positioned herself near a large painting that Wells seemed to be heading toward. When he stopped to look at it, she pretended to bump into him. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said, looking up as if surprised. Wells turned to her, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. Those eyes, Richard's eyes, looked directly into hers. No problem at all, he said with a British accent. Richard had been American. Up close, Eleanor could see tiny differences. A small scar near his hairline that Richard hadn't had. Slightly different wrinkles around his eyes. But the resemblance was still uncanny. "Alexander Wells," he said, extending his hand. "And you are?" Eleanor had prepared for this. "Victoria Barnes," she said, using her mother's maiden name. "I'm new to the art world. This is all rather overwhelming." Wells smiled. Richard's smile again. "The art crowd can be intimidating," he agreed. "But the paintings don't bite, at least." Eleanor laughed, pretending it was all normal while her heart threatened to burst from her chest. They talked about the painting for a few minutes. Eleanor watched his every move, every gesture. The way he held his champagne glass was exactly how Richard had held his. "If you'll excuse me," Wells said after a while, "I should greet my hosts." "Of course," Eleanor said. "It was nice meeting you." As Wells walked away, Eleanor noticed something that made her blood freeze. When Richard got nervous, he had always rubbed his left thumb against his palm, a habit from childhood. As Wells disappeared into the crowd, Eleanor saw him doing exactly that. Jensen appeared at her side. "Well, it's him," Eleanor whispered. "I don't know how, but it's him." "That's impossible," Jensen said. "You identified his body yourself." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes now hard with determination. "I need to get into his house. Can you make that happen?" Jensen looked uncomfortable. "Breaking and entering is illegal, Mrs. Davies." "I don't want to break in," Eleanor said. "I want an invitation." She watched as Wells chatted with the museum director across the room. "I know exactly how to get one." She already had a plan forming in her mind. If Alexander Wells was really Richard Davies, her husband who was supposed to be dead, she would find out the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, Eleanor paced her home office while Jensen spread papers across her desk. The private investigator had worked through the night gathering information on Alexander Wells. "Tell me everything," Eleanor said, her voice tense. Jensen pointed to a timeline he had created. Alexander Wells supposedly started his shipping company, Phoenix International, 3 years and 2 months ago. 2 months after Richard's death, Eleanor noted, sitting down slowly. "Exactly," Jensen said. "But here's the strange part. The company became worth billions almost overnight. No startup grows that fast without massive funding or existing connections." Eleanor picked up a document showing Phoenix International's financial records. Richard's company dealt with shipping technology. He knew the industry inside out. Jensen nodded. "I also checked Wells' public background. He claims to be British, educated at Oxford, but when I called the university, they had no record of him." "A fake background?" Eleanor's heart raced. "It gets more interesting," Jensen continued, sliding a medical form across the desk. "I have a contact at Cedars-Sinai. Wells was treated there 6 months ago for minor injuries after a car accident. His blood type is AB negative." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That's one of the rarest blood types in the world. Richard was AB negative too." "That could be coincidence," Jensen cautioned. "But there's more." He showed her security footage from a restaurant where Wells had dined last week. Eleanor watched as the waiter placed a dish in front of Wells, who immediately called the waiter back and appeared to ask questions about it. "He sent back the lobster dish," Jensen explained. The waiter confirmed Wells said he was allergic to shellfish. "Just like Richard," Eleanor whispered. "And watch this footage from outside his office building," Jensen said, pulling up another video. Eleanor watched Alexander Wells walking toward his car. His stride, the way he moved his arms, even the slight tilt of his head, it was all Richard. "Body language is almost impossible to fake," Jensen explained. "And look at his hands." The video zoomed in on Wells checking his watch. He held his wrist at the same odd angle Richard always had, a habit from breaking his wrist as a child. "How is this possible?" Eleanor asked, feeling dizzy. "I identified Richard's body. I saw him in the morgue." Jensen sighed heavily. "That's what I've been asking myself. The yacht explosion was severe. The body was badly damaged. You identified him based on his wedding ring and the birthmark on his shoulder," Eleanor finished. "The face was too damaged to recognize. Could the body have belonged to someone else?" Eleanor stood and walked to her window, looking out at the ocean where Richard's yacht had exploded 3 years ago. But why? Why would Richard fake his own death? Jensen hesitated. There's one more thing you should see. He passed her a thin folder. This was sealed as part of an ongoing investigation. My contact at the FBI shared it off the record. Eleanor opened the folder and began reading. Her hands started to shake. Financial fraud? Money laundering? They were investigating Richard's company before his death. The investigation was dropped after he died, Jensen explained. But according to my source, they were close to making an arrest. Eleanor sat down heavily, memories flooding back. Richard's strange behavior in the weeks before his death. His late nights at the office. The way he'd insisted on that solo yacht trip when he'd always wanted her with him before. He ran, she whispered. He escaped before they could arrest him. And created a new identity, Jensen added. New face, new accent, new life. Eleanor thought of the man she'd spoken to at the gala. His face was similar to Richard's but not identical. Subtle plastic surgery could explain the differences. I need to know for sure, she said finally, her voice hardening. I need concrete proof. Jensen looked concerned. What are you planning? Eleanor stood, her decision made. I'm going to get into his house, and I know exactly how to do it. She picked up her phone and dialed. Hello, is this Phoenix International? Yes, I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Wells. It's regarding a potential investment opportunity. The gates of Alexander Wells' mansion opened slowly. Eleanor sat in the back of her chauffeured car, trying to keep her breathing steady. She wore a navy business suit and carried a leather portfolio filled with investment proposals, her excuse to meet Wells in his home. I'll wait here, Mrs. Davies, her driver said as she stepped out. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. After a week of calls and negotiation, Wells had finally agreed to meet her, or rather, to meet Victoria Barnes, the wealthy investor she was pretending to be. A housekeeper opened the front door. Mr. Wells is waiting for you in the study, Miss Barnes. Eleanor followed the woman through the grand entrance hall. Her eyes darted everywhere, looking for signs of Richard. The house was beautifully decorated but felt impersonal, like a hotel. No family photos, no personal touches. The housekeeper stopped at a heavy wooden door and knocked softly. Come in, called a voice from inside, Richard's voice. Eleanor stepped into a large study lined with bookshelves. Alexander Wells stood by the window, backlit by the afternoon sun. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Miss Barnes, he said finally, extending his hand. A pleasure to meet you in person. Eleanor shook his hand, feeling its warmth. Richard's hands had always been warm. Thank you for agreeing to meet, she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Wells gestured to the chairs by his desk. Please, sit. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee? Tea? Water would be fine, Eleanor said. As Wells poured water from a crystal pitcher, Eleanor studied him. His movements were so familiar it made her heart ache. For 30 minutes, they discussed business. Eleanor presented her fake investment proposal while watching Wells' every reaction. He was smart, articulate, and confident, just like Richard had been. Finally, when the housekeeper had left them alone again after bringing fresh drinks, Eleanor decided it was time. You have a beautiful home, Mr. Wells, she said. Thank you. He smiled politely. It reminds me of a house my husband and I once considered buying, she continued, watching him closely, before he died. Something flickered in Wells' eyes. Alarm? Recognition? She couldn't be sure. I'm sorry for your loss, he said smoothly. Was it recent? 3 years ago, Eleanor said. A yacht explosion. Wells' fingers twitched slightly. How tragic. Eleanor set down her water glass. The strange thing is, she said, her voice now harder, I recently saw a man who looks exactly like my dead husband. Wells went very still. Miss Barnes, I'm not sure. My name isn't Victoria Barnes, she interrupted. It's Eleanor Davies. And I think you know that already, don't you, Richard? The room went silent. Wells stared at her, his face showing nothing at first. Then he rubbed his thumb against his palm, Richard's nervous habit. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his British accent suddenly less convincing. I think you should leave. Eleanor didn't move. AB negative blood type, shellfish allergy, the scar on your right knee from college football. Should I continue? Wells stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. You always rub your thumb against your palm when you're nervous, Eleanor said, rising to face him. Richard did that since he was a child. His mother told me. Coincidence, Wells said, but his voice wavered. Take off your watch, Eleanor demanded. What? Your watch. Take it off. Wells hesitated, then slowly removed his expensive watch. On the inside of his wrist was a small, faded scar shaped like a crescent moon. Richard had gotten that scar when he fell off his bike at 9 years old. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Why, Richard? Why did you do this to me? For a long moment, Wells just stared at her. Then something in his face changed. The British accent disappeared completely when he finally spoke. How did you find me, Ellie? Richard's voice. Richard's words. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She'd been right. The man she had loved, mourned, and buried was standing in front of her, very much alive. I saw you, she whispered. By accident. Walking into this house. Richard, because it was Richard, sank back into his chair, the disguise of Alexander Wells falling away with each passing second. You were never supposed to know, he said quietly. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the man she had loved and mourned. Richard, or Alexander, as he now called himself, looked back at her with familiar eyes that now held unfamiliar coldness. Sit down, Eleanor, he said quietly. She remained standing. 3 years, she whispered. 3 years I thought you were dead. I identified your body. I buried you. I mourned you. Richard sighed heavily and poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter. His hands shook slightly. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. What way was it supposed to happen? Eleanor's voice rose. You were supposed to stay dead while I spent the rest of my life grieving for you. Yes, he said simply, and the coldness of his answer made Eleanor step back. Richard took a long drink and then placed his glass carefully on the desk. The FBI was closing in. They had evidence. Real evidence of what I'd been doing with the company funds. The money laundering, Eleanor said. I know about that now. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been busy. Did you think I would just walk away after seeing you? Eleanor moved closer to him. Why, Richard? We had everything. Money, love, respect. Why risk it all? Richard laughed without humor. We didn't have everything. What we had was a company that was failing in debts I couldn't pay. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at his perfectly manicured garden. The Russian clients offered a way out. Move their money through our shipping contracts, take a percentage. Simple. Illegal, Eleanor corrected. Yes, illegal, he admitted. And then the FBI started asking questions. My contact warned me they were preparing to make arrests. He turned back to face her. Do you know what federal prison is like, Eleanor? I couldn't face that. So you chose to die instead. The full weight of his betrayal was sinking in now. Richard nodded. Jacques helped me. You remember my sailing partner? Eleanor remembered the Frenchman who had often joined Richard on his yacht trips. The body I identified was Jacques. He had terminal cancer, 6 months to live. I paid him $5 million to help me disappear. Money his family now enjoys. Eleanor felt sick. He agreed to die for you. He was dying anyway. The explosion was planned to damage the body beyond easy recognition. You identified me by my ring and birthmark. Richard touched his shoulder where the distinctive birthmark had been, both easily transferred to Jacques. The calculated coldness of it all made Eleanor's head spin. And then what? You had plastic surgery and became Alexander Wells? Richard nodded. Minor changes to my face. New accent. New background. I used money I'd hidden offshore to start Phoenix International. While I sold our house and donated half her clothes to charity, Eleanor said bitterly, while I cried myself to sleep every night. For the first time, Richard looked uncomfortable. I never wanted to hurt you, Ellie. But I couldn't take you with me. It would have raised too many questions. You never even considered it, did you? Eleanor realized. You just decided your life was more important than our marriage. Richard didn't deny it. He walked to a painting on the wall and swung it open, revealing a safe. After entering the combination, you removed a small black box and handed it to Eleanor. Inside was a USB drive. "What's this?" she asked. "Insurance," Richard explained. "Details of every illegal transaction, every fake contract, every offshore account. Names of everyone involved, including some very powerful people who would not want this information public." You met her eyes directly. "My get-out-of-jail-free card." Eleanor held the small drive in her hand, understanding slowly dawning. "This is why you weren't afraid to come back to Los Angeles. Why you live so close to our old life." Richard nodded. "No one can touch me as long as I have copies of this information secured. If I'm arrested or harmed, it all goes public." Eleanor looked at the man before her, the stranger wearing her husband's face. She had loved Richard with all her heart. But this man, this calculating, selfish man, was not the person she thought she had married. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Richard took a step toward her. "That depends on you, Ellie." Eleanor stood in Richard's study, the USB drive still in her hand. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What do you mean? It depends on me?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. Richard moved toward her, stopping when he saw her step back. "I still care about you, Ellie. I always did." Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You cared so much that you let me think you were dead for 3 years." "I had no choice," Richard insisted, running his hand through his hair, another familiar gesture that now made Eleanor's stomach turn. "But now that you know I'm alive, we have options." "We?" Eleanor repeated. "There is no we anymore, Richard. You killed that when you killed yourself." Richard poured himself another drink, his movements less smooth now. "You could join me," he said, not meeting her eyes. "We can start over somewhere else. I have enough money for 10 lifetimes." "Money you stole." "Money I earned," he corrected sharply. "Yes, some of my methods were questionable, but I built something real with Phoenix International." Eleanor stared at him, really seeing him for the first time. The man she had married 25 years ago, the man she thought she knew better than anyone, was a stranger to her now. "Did you ever love me?" she asked suddenly. "Really love me?" Richard looked surprised. "Of course I did. I still do." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head slowly. "Love doesn't do this. Love doesn't fake a death and leave someone to suffer alone." "I was trying to protect you," Richard insisted. "If I had told you about the investigation, you would have been implicated too." "So you made the decision for me," Eleanor said. "Just like you always did. What restaurant we ate at, what house we bought, what friends we kept. You always knew best, didn't you, Richard?" Richard's face hardened. "I gave you a good life." "You gave me a lie," Eleanor countered. "Our entire marriage was built on your secrets and your control." She walked to the window, looking out at the garden she would have once helped design if their life together had been real. When she turned back, her eyes were clear. "I want a divorce," she said simply. Richard laughed. "We can't get divorced, Eleanor. I'm legally dead." "Alexander Wells can pay me what I'm owed," Eleanor replied. "Half of everything, including Phoenix International." Richard's face darkened. "That's not going to happen." "Then I'll go to the FBI," Eleanor said, holding up the USB drive. "With this?" "You wouldn't," Richard challenged, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "The Richard I thought I knew wouldn't have abandoned me either," Eleanor said. "We're both full of surprises." Richard stared at her for a long moment, calculation clear in his eyes. Then he seemed to make a decision. His posture relaxed, and that charming smile she had once loved appeared on his face. "You're right," he said softly. "You deserve better. We can work something out." He walked toward her, arms outstretched as if for an embrace. Eleanor stepped back. "Don't touch me," she said. "I don't know you anymore." Pain flickered across Richard's face, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the man she had married, but then his expression changed again, becoming hard and cold. "What exactly do you want, Eleanor?" he asked. "The truth," she said simply. "All of it, and then we'll discuss what happens next." Richard nodded slowly. "The truth is I was drowning in debt. The company was failing. I took money from people I shouldn't have. When the feds started investigating, I knew I'd go to prison for decades. His voice became bitter. I wasn't going to let that happen. So you sacrificed everything else, Eleanor said. Our marriage, my happiness, even another man's life. Jacques was dying anyway, Richard repeated stubbornly. Eleanor looked at him with pity now. And that makes it okay, using his death for your escape? Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. Eleanor could finally see the truth about the man she had married. He would always put himself first. He always had. I'll be back tomorrow with my lawyer, Eleanor said, putting the USB drive in her pocket. Don't try to run. Don't try to stop me. As she walked toward the door, Richard called after her. I did love you, Ellie, in my way. Eleanor paused but didn't turn around. Your way wasn't enough, she said quietly, and left. 1 year later, Eleanor Davies sat in her office overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Outside her window, the city sparkled under the afternoon sun. On her desk sat a newspaper with the headline, Jiping Maginate Alexandr Wells Pleadsqlt 2 FRAUD charges. Eleanor closed the file she had been reading and sighed deeply. The past year had been the hardest of her life, but also strangely freeing. After leaving Richard's mansion that day, Eleanor had not gone straight to the FBI as she had threatened. Instead, she had met with her lawyer and carefully planned her next steps. The USB drive had contained exactly what Richard claimed: evidence of massive financial crimes involving powerful people around the world. Ms. Davies, your 3 o'clock appointment is here, her assistant said through the intercom. Send them in, Eleanor replied, standing to greet the young couple who entered her office. Thank you for meeting with us, the woman said, shaking Eleanor's hand. Your foundation's work has given us hope. Eleanor smiled warmly. That's exactly why I started it. The Eleanor Davies Foundation for Fraud Victims had been her response to Richard's betrayal. She had used a portion of her settlement from Alexander Wells to create a support system for people whose lives had been destroyed by financial crimes. The couple sat down, and Eleanor listened to their story of losing everything to a skillful con artist. As she took notes and explained how her foundation could help, she remembered the day she had finally confronted Richard with her decision. She had returned to his mansion with her lawyer, but without the FBI. She had offered Richard a deal, a substantial financial settlement to her in exchange for her silence about his true identity. Richard had laughed at first, thinking she was bluffing. You won't turn me in, he had said confidently. You still love me. I loved a man who never existed, Eleanor had replied calmly, and I'm not bluffing. To prove her point, she had shown him papers already prepared for filing with the FBI, papers that would expose his entire scheme. Richard's face had gone pale. In the end, he had agreed to her terms. Eleanor received 40% of Phoenix International and a cash settlement of $50 million. She had signed papers promising never to reveal Richard's true identity. But Eleanor had kept one final card to play. After the settlement was complete, she had anonymously tipped off federal investigators about irregularities in Alexander Wells' business practices. Not about his identity, but about current illegal activities she had discovered while examining the USB drive's contents. The investigation had moved quickly. Within 6 months, Alexander Wells was indicted on charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. The evidence was overwhelming. Now, as Eleanor finished her meeting with the young couple, she walked them to the door of her office. We'll have a support plan ready for you by next week, she promised. And our legal team will help you navigate the court process. After they left, Eleanor walked to her window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, Richard was awaiting sentencing, his empire crumbling around him. The man who had once been her husband would likely spend the next decade in prison. Eleanor felt no joy in this thought, but no sadness either, just a quiet sense of justice. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her dinner date for that evening. A kind professor of literature she had met at a charity function. Nothing serious yet, but she enjoyed his company. As Eleanor gathered her things to leave the office, she passed a framed photo on her wall. It showed her cutting the ribbon at the foundation's opening ceremony, surrounded by her team. Her face in the picture was smiling, confident, and most importantly, at peace. Eleanor had lost a husband twice, once to death and once to truth. But in that painful process, she had found herself again, not as Richard Davies' wife or Alexander Wells' widow, but simply as Eleanor, stronger, wiser, and finally free.